It's Monday, April 15th. I'm Adam Walsh, and this is The Signal. Today's show turns the pages of the book on this province's unique folklore and superstitions. We have a couple of local authors here in the studio to talk about the storytelling of it all. We're asking you, do you have a tale about a mythical creature or the unexplained in your community? Get in touch. Because we're a province of storytellers, right? Every nook and cranny of this province has its stories. And from light to dark, that's this big range. You can have fairies, mermaids, selkies, you name it. Sometimes the devil, all of it. Why do we have these stories? What can they mean? Why do they persist? So this is what we're talking about today. And as you're listening, like I just said there at the start of the show, if you've got a tale about a mythical creature or something unexplained in your community, right? Thinking fairies and others, give us a call, 709-722-7111, 1-800-563-8255. You can text us, 709-327-8206, or emails thesignal@cbc.ca. The lines are open. In the meantime, I will introduce you to two local authors for this chat. We're going to, like I said, we're talking magical realism, folklore elements in storytelling. So we've got Clayton B. Smith and Helen C. Escott. Hello, hello. How you both doing?
Good afternoon. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks. Nice to be here.
Thanks for coming in. So the way this also works too, like we get rounds of new books coming out and publishers get in touch with me, and then I try to, whenever I can think of a theme for a show, I always enjoy kind of thinking, okay, what's the new book? Who else can we invite? What's the conversation? So Clayton, tell us about your book.
Yes, this is my first novel published through Breakwater, and it is, really just a grabbing of local folklore and trying to tell it in a way that could be real, could be just an exaggerated storytelling. I feel like so much of that is prevalent throughout the province. We have these stories that are exaggerated to a point that the line between reality and fiction gets a little blurry. So I decided to take that and embrace it in a way that can kind of teach a lesson, but also be fun, be enjoyable to let the imagination play and run with it.
It's called A Seal of Salvage, right? Yeah. And so you grew up in Glovertown. How much, like for the area, how much did that speak to you when you're writing this? Because, it's not Glovertown, right? But it's further away. But what were your thoughts around that?
Oh, humongously. It was inspired a lot by not just like the landscape and the town itself, but the people that I grew up with. Like there's always this culture of no one. I like to think of Newfoundlanders as almost agnostic when it comes to fairies. No one's really willing to say they're completely not there. They're not atheists about it, but no one really believes in them. No one admits to believing in them. And that was always prevalent in like just the stories you heard growing up. Some people would, like my grandmother would always still encourage us to keep crumbs in our pockets when we walked around bogs, you know?
Oh,
she would never say
on.
that it was because of the fairies, but she still wanted you to do it.
Not because of the fairies.
Precisely, yeah. So that kind of, that culture of keeping a little bit of that mystery, that uncertainty there, the wariness that people kept around things that they didn't quite understand. Really, it was what inspired the story to begin with.
Cool. So Clay, when we got Clay on board, right? So we were like, okay, new book, Seal of Salvage. Halfway through it, excellent book, by the way. Really enjoying it. So we had Clay on board, and then we thought, like, who else can we for this? Who would be great for this conversation? And Ellen, you came to mind, of course.
Thank you. I thank you. When you think of strange things, you think of me. That's great.
Yeah, I mean, I thought someone who could talk a lot about literature and folklore and really give it some oomph, and especially because of, is it Operation Vanished, right?
Operation Vanished, yes.
Tell us about it.
Well, Operation Vanished is a fictional investigation I did into murdered and missing women in rural Newfoundland in the 1950s. And it goes back through the history of women's rights in this province. It starts in 1929 was when women became persons under law in Canada. Before 1929, we weren't persons. My mother was born in 1927, so she wasn't a person for 2 years. So it casually takes you back, because my books are not just about the whodunit. My books are always a journey. You're going to learn something you didn't know before. So this Operation Vantage takes you back through women's rights in Newfoundland. And in the book, when I look at they're fictional murders, but they're always based on true crime. You'll find a lot of times people will say, a woman will go missing and they'll say, the fairies took her away. Or she'll show up with a black eye and they'll say, oh, that's a fairy blast she got when she walked home from bingo last night. Well, everybody knew who the fairies were in small communities, and they certainly didn't punch women in the face or go off with them. But it was how people explained things that they just didn't want to understand.
It's such an interesting range, right? Because you can have, mythical creatures explaining the unknown in a way, right? So we don't know what happened. Or, in this case, the really uncomfortable, the stuff that you can't talk about because of any number of reasons.
Yeah, exactly. It's people in isolated communities. And my mother used to always say the fairies don't live anywhere there's streetlights. So there's no fairies in St. John's. But in rural communities, in isolated communities, they did believe in the fairies. And it was how they did. They explained things that they couldn't really understand or didn't want to understand. They'd say, oh, the fairies did it, that kind of thing. And you know what? The fairies took the blame for a lot of dark going-ons in families. And if you think back on the true fairy tales, not the ones that came from Ireland, Scotland, Wales, and England, and you look at what Disney did to them, that's not the same fairy tale.
No.
Because the original fairy tale would scare the bejesus out of a child.
Yeah.
You wouldn't read the real, if you go back and read the actual fairy tale, it's nothing like Disney produces. And women never fare well in fairy tales. We always have to marry somebody. We always have to lose our tail. We always have to give up something in the fairy tale.
Clayton, what do you think?
Yeah, it's interesting. I find I'm focused more on the Selkie, which is originally a Scottish folklore coming from like the Orkney Islands. Fairly prevalent here, but not as much as fairies are in Newfoundland. And I found that the biggest thing I found with that was that it was about strangers. It was about people that weren't from those small communities. So there was a way to kind of express a wariness towards anyone that wasn't from that small town. So it's just a way of kind of justifying a xenophobia, I suppose. It was creating this legend of a Selkie or of someone that, since they weren't from here, we shouldn't quite trust them. There's something a little bit off of them. And again, at the end of the day, these were just regular people from other places that instead these folklores were developed around.
Both these books touch on the 50s, which is like I didn't realize until like you were both lined up. What is it about the 50s for these books that was important for this?
For me, it was because in the 50s, rural communities were very isolated.
Yeah.
Some didn't have TV channels. If they had, they probably had one or two if they could get them. They listened by radio. That was where they got their news or through word of mouth. So that's where a lot of folklore comes from, is people will invent the story around the story. So that's kind of where it grows there.
Yeah, and the 50s, some spots weren't hooked up to power and indoor plumbing yet at that point for
right.
Newfoundland and Labrador.
Exactly, and a police officer may take 1 or 2 days to get to your community
right.
if there was a murder. So they'd have to keep a body on ice somewhere until a police officer got in and looked. And of course, the body would be moved, the crime scene would be tainted. So there were a lot of things that would go wrong in a murder investigation in the 1950s because of that, because of isolation. And we didn't have roads that were paved all the way through the community, so it could take a very long time to get a very short distance.
And so many of the islands were still so heavily populated as well. So they're only reached by boats and with the occasional merchant ship that came through. Otherwise, it was just those communities. There was really no way to access the rest of the greater island. Yeah,
thinking about it, it's wild because it is. There's a lot of you can easily see how you could have rich stories coming from this type of a setting, right? From like the isolation, the seclusion, and everything else that goes on. Especially if all of a sudden you're incorporating some magical realism or whatever else that you're bringing into a story with folklore thoughts, around it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the fairies would be how, you got to think of the education level back in the 1950s. Yeah. So in the 1950s, we had just come from World War II. Newfoundland had just joined Canada, so it was all new to us. So there was a lot of things, a lot of outside influence starting to come in and kind of wrestle with the beliefs of the communities. One of the things that I read in one article Americans used to really laugh at was because we had a lot of bases, American bases here at that time also, is that they would call the whole changeling population. So what would happen if you had anybody they would consider less than human in ways would be called a changeling because they didn't understand. They had a perfectly normal baby, and you'll hear stories of, I had a perfectly normal baby and I went out to hang the clothes, and when I came in I had a changeling.
Right.
And what a changeling would be is, nobody knew what autism was in the 1950s. Nobody really knew what schizophrenia was. Nobody knew, what all these mental health diseases were, or even learning disabilities. So they would say, well, I had a perfectly normal baby, but around 2, they turned into a changeling, because that's about the age that, childhood diseases will start to show, or schizophrenia later on in life. And they're a changeling now. The fairy came in, took our child, and gave us a sickling, and we have to take care of it because they have our child. But that's how they would explain all these diseases. And then they would use horrific methods to get the fairy out of them. There was quite common to put the poker in the stove and lay it on the baby's belly to scare the fairy out of them. And of course, the baby would go into shock and they'd go, "Look, there it worked." Yeah. So it was sometimes the medicine was worse than the actual disease.
Yeah, a lot. That's quite the image too, right? Just thinking about it. But then, like you said, education levels, isolation, and just the back decades ago, and just the lack of knowledge around so many different things compared to now. So these were the answers. Like, hey, we don't know, so hey, let's blame the fairies.
That's right. And it's not like autism didn't exist.
No.
It did. No. Yeah. They just didn't know what it was. So because the child would be acting so different and sometimes violent, they would think, it's the devil in them or it's a fairy in them. And they would sometimes, and they'd say, beat the fairy out of you. That was a common Newfoundland phrase, they'll beat the fairy out of you. And oftentimes children would be beaten and they'd go, "Oh, look, it worked," but the child's really in shock.
Yeah. No. Right on.
It acted as like a self-preservation for some of these families and these parents as well, because having a sick child or having someone unwell was a poor reflection on the family, on the bloodline and everything. But if you can instead blame it on a possession via a fairy.
Yeah, it's not us. It's not this bloodline. It's the fairies or the whatever else.
Yeah, so the mythology kind of protects them, so they don't need to. Yeah, they don't need to own up to potential mistakes they made or just a natural occurrence. They can instead say, no, this was something unnatural that came into our home that took it over, and therefore it's not our fault.
Exactly. And it was used to explain violence against women. And in Operation Vanished, I give the true story of this lady called Bridget Clary in Ireland. And she was now, if a woman was clever or smart, she would be fairy-led, because she was too smart. Because at that time, men believed women were not as intelligent as them, and they couldn't do the same work. So when they found a woman who could and was smarter, then she was fairy.
Oh, wow.
So her husband had this fairy doctor come in, and he told the husband, "You have to tie her to the bed, and then we're going to get the fairy out of her." So this poor woman has nothing wrong with her, gets tied to the bed, and the fairy doctor says, "You have to keep throwing your urine on top of her." And not feed her. So for days, this woman is having urine thrown on top of her. And of course, then she's getting more angry. And eventually, over a number of days, they say, "Okay, let's pour gasoline over her and light the match, and then the fairy will be gone and your wife will be back." Well, of course, they burnt her alive while her father and brother were there in the room because they believed in fairies. Well, they found out afterwards, the police actually, and this is back, in the 1800s, long time. So when the police actually charged the husband and found out he was actually having an affair. So he was using this fairy thing, and he was actually convicted and served, I think it was 15 years in jail, and because he couldn't convince the jury that he was doing this to get the fairy out. And then when he came out, he actually moved to Montreal. But, so this was how, think of how horrific this poor woman who was just intelligent, running her own little business and being urinated on, being, lit on fire in front of your father and brother. And this guy, and they're going to stand around and go, "Yeah, I think that's going to happen. Yeah, I think the fairy will come out and she'll be fine.
This will work."
This will work, yeah. So talk about how violence against women, and the whole point of his doing this was to get rid of his wife.
Yeah.
So he could marry the mistress. So you talk about how violence against women was normalized, because if the wrong police officer had come in and said, "No, I believe in fairies, you're right, that was a good thing to do," and walked out, she would have never got justice.
Right. Yeah, you just use it as an excuse, right? Like it's, wow, it's wild. Clay, what do you think?
Yeah, I have a kind of a touch of this similar thing in this. My protagonist, Oliver Brown, grows up as an orphan. His mother was said to be a selkie throughout the town. That's the community's kind of unspoken belief of her. And primarily, precisely as you said, Helen, because she was intelligent and from somewhere else and pretty, and therefore there's a jealousy factor that created this. But then what ends up happening is she's suffering from something, I guess, probably most similar to postpartum depression, and no one really has a way to describe that or understand that. So their means of like fixing it is just isolating her with her child, which is with no help, with no one around, and then obviously she's getting worse and worse and becoming more lonely and more hysterical, and they're blaming this on her being a creature from somewhere else, on being this mythical thing. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy, you know. They're creating the scenario in which everything they've claimed is going to prove is true, and suddenly the community can get away with some horrendous things just by what they've claimed in this folklore. You're both going to read a little section from each book, right? All right, let me just do a reset. This is the signal. This is how we do a reset, by the way. As we say in the biz, a reset. This is the signal. I'm Adam Walsh. Today on the show, we're talking about folklore, superstitions, mythical creatures, the unexplained, through a lens of storytelling and literature on today's show. For you, in your nook and cranny community of Newfoundland and Labrador, wherever you are, if you have a story about whether it's fairies, mermaids, selkies, you name it, get in touch with us. Give us a call, 709-722-7111, 1-800-563-8255. The text line is open, 709-327-8206. Emails thesignal@cbc.ca. I've got two local authors here in studio, Clayton B. Smith and Helen C. Escott. Clay, set up the bit, because you're reading from the start, right, of the book, but just set it up a bit for us for what's about to happen and what you're about to read. Yeah, so I'm reading from A Seal of Salvage. Each of the chapters of the book takes from a different Newfoundland terminology. So I'm going to read from the very first chapter, the very first page, in fact, which is actually named after the town of Salvage. It's funny, naming the book A Seal of Salvage always invited this issue where people are going to call it A Seal of Salvage, unless you're from Newfoundland and know the township itself. Yeah, of course, because, I didn't even think about that, because, it's Seal of Salvage. Wait, no, Salvage. Yeah, I mean, my copy editor was from Nova Scotia, and just whenever we spoke on the phone, she was like, Seal of Salvage. I'm like Salvage. It's the same origin, but slightly different. Yeah. So my first, the first section I'm going to read here, just it sort of sets up our narrator, who isn't a present character in the book, but talks a little bit about Newfoundland storytelling. Sure, go for it. You won't struggle to hear a yarn about Oliver Brown, but to hear the true story is more of an endeavor. Down the end of Main Street, there's a salt box that's lasted a full century, and in it lives the widow Rebecca Ginge. If, for some reason, you fancy hearing the story of Oliver's time in Salvage, Mrs. Ginge is who you should find. She knew him for a short time, you see, not well enough to think that she deserves to be called his friend, but well enough that by the end, he might have called her one. Mrs. Ginge is known to be a storyteller, the type only her generation could ever produce. A teller of stories littered with inconsequential characters and riddled with inconsistencies, but always close enough to being plausible and anchored in just enough of reality that you can't help but anxiously await every word. She never let the story of Oliver run away. He'd saved her husband's life, at least once, that's for certain, so perhaps she felt she owed it to him to keep the tale honest. The story begins before Oliver had ever been thought of, as many of these stories do. Although Rebecca was even further from being a consideration, she had asked enough questions of enough people over the years that at least a gesturing towards the truth had been compiled. It's a story at the beginning that Oliver himself was told on a stormy night when he was only a boy. These days, few of the folk who tell the tale can agree on what the cause for the party was. What all these storytellers are consistent about is that everyone in the town had been aware of the disappearance of Stella's dress. Some will include in their stories the size of the full moon or the sudden strength of the northeast gale. Some will say the moon was bright enough that it could have been midday at midnight, while others will claim that there was no moon at all, and the fog was so thick you couldn't count your own fingers. According to Mrs. Ginge, though, the moon was not full, nor was it noon. It was an obscure moon giving half colors to quarter things. It offered some guidance, but one still had to be careful getting home. The fog had settled late and just offshore, and the boats were all in long before it blanketed the harbor. Mrs. Ginge believes that the night was that of Robert Feltham's wedding. Feltham was the mayor of Salvage, and had been for some time. All of the town and half the next two coves, and a fair portion of the next bay, had been there for the occasion. And, despite the claims of every storyteller, not one of the souls in the church hall that night, including Stella herself, had any idea that her dress hadn't been on the line when she'd taken in her clothes that afternoon. Awesome. Thanks for that. No problem.
Yeah, like I said, I've been reading through the book. I just love the narration in it and the description used, and also some of the names kind of ring a bit from my upbringing and my background. Some of the names ring a bell, which is nice.
But Stella's actually the name of my late grandmother, and and there's one section later on in Token. There's a story that she told me growing up that she had written down that I took almost word for word into one of the characters' dialogues there. That is exactly what she told me about experiencing a token.
Helen, does that speak to you about taking a story from a relative that's passed down and then all of a sudden it gets translated later into lit? Like, I mean, that's a lot of, like, that speaks to you too, right? Because you do a lot of work around this.
Absolutely. Oh, listen, every friend, every family member in my life knows it's all copy. If you're telling me something, don't say it's a secret. It's going to end up in a book somewhere. And that's just my right as a Newfoundlander. That's what we do. We pass down stories, good and bad.
Oh, I love it. Yeah, and yes, that is very true. All right, set up what you're going to read for us now.
This is in the first chapter, and the main character is RCMP Corporal Gail McNaughton, and she is new in the unit and the major crime unit, and she was given the task of investigating some historical crimes, and it's kind of like an initiation process into the unit. It's files nobody else could solve. So she goes out and she meets with this lady, Mary. And when Mary was young, her and her sister Ellen were picking berries in the back, and Ellen was taken away by the fairies. And she's investigating this missing child report.
From Operation Vanished, right?
Operation Vanished from Flanker Press. No, not everyone loved Ellen, you know. She was sorry. No, not really. Everyone loved Ellen, you know. She was such a lovable child, considering all the struggles she had in her short life. Struggles? What kind of struggles? Well, she wasn't as quick as the other children at school. She had a hard time remembering numbers for some reason. She couldn't remember much of anything the teacher said, but she never forgot the nursery rhymes, probably because we sang them so often. Why was that? Mom said she was born perfectly normal, but one day she was hanging out clothes and heard Ellen crying in the playpen. Ellen was about 2 then. When she went inside, she said Ellen looked different. After that, Ellen was slow learning to walk and talk. She couldn't keep up with the other girls her age and had to make signs with her hands to tell us what she wanted. She didn't use many words. She would often rock back and forth and stare off into space. Was she developmentally delayed? McNaughton couldn't remember seeing this in the file. No, she was a changeling, Mary informed her. A changeling? Well, that's what my mother believed. While she was hanging out clothes, she believed the good people came and took her healthy baby and replaced her with a changeling. McNaughton looked up from her notes. I don't understand. What good people? Mary finished her tea with a gulp. The good people were known to sneak into houses and substitute one of their sickly babies for a healthy baby. They used to do that all the time, not so much nowadays. You mean like gypsies or some other group like that? No, the good people. Mary lowered her voice to a whisper and continued, the fairies, she added, putting her finger to her lips like she had said a swear word. McNaughton had heard of fairy folklore but didn't know much about it. Fairies didn't visit St. John's where she grew up. They didn't like streetlights, or so Doris, her mother, once said. They were an outport tradition. How did your mother treat Ellen after the good people turned her into a changeling? Oh, she treated her as she always did. Once the good people take your child, you have to treat the changeling as you would your own, because that's how they will treat your child. I see. McNaughton went back to her notebook. Did your mother resent Ellen in any way? No, she loved Ellen. Everywhere Mom went, she took Ellen. What do you really think happened to your sister? Maybe the good people came back for her, Mary said with a nod. That may have been what you believed back in 1950. But today, Mary, knowing that fairies or good people don't exist, what do you think happened to your sister? McNaughton asked. I don't know. Maybe the good people did take her away. Mary looked quite serious. Why would you believe that? McNaughton was taken aback by her answer. Because they changed her when she was a baby. Maybe they came back to get her.
And thank you for that. That was great.
Thank you.
Yeah, and it speaks to everything we're talking about for, like what you mentioned, right? For just what folklore has been used for over the years with fairies, and when it comes to women and what's gone on over years with them, right? And in everywhere, really.
Oh, absolutely. Like I said, they were used to police women and explain things. You see a woman who's beaten black and blue, and they'd say, "Oh, it's the fairies. The fairies took her," or But everybody knew who the fairies were, and fairies didn't rape and kill women. Men did that.
Yeah.
And a lot of times in isolated communities, everybody's related. So you're not going to say your father is beating your mother. You're not going to say your grandfather is molesting this child. You're not going to say, because you're not going to taint the family name. So you have to come up with something else to say, look, this, and there's I give the story of a real child who went missing in Newfoundland, and she was found, I think it was 10 days later, and they said the fairies kept her alive. But when she was found, she was still fully clothed, and her clothes were clean. And when they got her home, she would just hide in cupboards, and she would. There was an uncle that anytime he'd come around, she was trauma. But they kept saying, "Oh, the fairies had her." But you had to know your brother was next door and had her.
Yeah.
There had to be something in your mind, but you're never going to accuse your brother of that. So you go with the fairy story. And then everybody around you goes with the fairy story, because everybody in that community got a fairy story.
Getting ready for this show, I spoke with Deidre Nuttall, who is an Irish writer. Deidre has a PhD in folklore and ethnology and has done a bunch of field work here. So I spoke to, we were emailing back and forth. I spoke with Deidre this morning. This is about a 4.5-minute conversation, and this will kind of turn the page into some of the research that gets done. So take a listen.
I've always been interested in the spooky things and the supernatural, and Newfoundland was always kind of at the back of my mind, because I grew up in a part of Ireland that a lot of Newfoundlanders' ancestors left from, and I was vaguely aware of Newfoundland because I knew some of my ancestors had gone there in the early to 1800s, and I know I must have distant relatives over there. I've never met them, and there's another story in my family that someone who had attempted to murder one of my ancestors fled on a boat to Newfoundland. So it was always kind of a storied place, in our family. So then when I was doing my postgrad studies, I thought, it would be so exciting to do a comparative study of stories in Newfoundland and stories in Ireland.
What did you find out as you're doing your comparative study? Like, what are some things that really kind of, struck you?
Well, the landscapes between are very different in Newfoundland than in Ireland, and they're very different in particular compared to the part of Ireland that I'm from. And I think that really affects the stories and how they're told and how they're experienced. Newfoundland is much less densely populated, and the climate is harsher and more extreme. And I think all of those things have impacted on the stories, although there are definitely common threads. Ireland has a lot of the same kind of figures appear in traditional stories as in Newfoundland. And I do think that all of that kind of background of oral storytelling has influenced both of our respective written literatures. So I definitely see some commonalities between them too.
What is it that makes folks believe in, whether it's fairy folk or mermaids or any other number of things that have been conjured up in the imagination over the years? What do you think kind of impressions that on folks, and then to get them to keep telling these stories over and over?
Well, there are lots of different factors, but I think one of them is that, sometimes things happen and we can't explain them. Someone's born with a disability, or something awful happens, or some mysterious thing is experienced and you can't really explain it using rational means. And these stories fill in that gap. And they're also fun to listen to, so, they get repeated.
What then for yourself, what for your research over here, what are some things that kind of stood out to you? They were like, oh, that's really neat, or that was really interesting, or that's a story that really kind of stood out for me?
I was really interested in some of the stories about kind of the devil, and there were lots of stories about people seeing the devil on their way back from playing cards or being out for a night drinking. We have similar stories here, but they were slightly different here. They tended to have a slightly more political edge, maybe subconscious political edge, because in Ireland the stories usually depict the devil as an Englishman for obvious reasons. With our history, it was a social commentary as well as a story. And I did see that in Newfoundland it was a bit different. They had a slightly different relationship with those stories. That was interesting.
And what about when it comes to like fairy stories? How similar or different are they between spots?
They're similar. They do seem to be a bit more immediate in Newfoundland. Like they seemed that this was a while ago that I was doing this research, but certainly at that time and the years previously, they seemed to be taken more seriously in Newfoundland than in Ireland. So I think that they were still being used as an explanation for inexplicable facts more recently in Newfoundland than here, perhaps.
Well, that's really interesting.
Yeah.
And you've got a trip. You're coming here soon, right?
Yes. Can't wait.
What are you going to be doing?
I'm going to be visiting our mutual friend and your colleague Todd O'Brien and his lovely wife, Andrea. I'm going to be going with another friend of mine, Andrea O'Brien, on a trip up the Burin Peninsula, and we're actually going to just have a nice time looking at that. And really can't wait. I'm always really lucky when I come to Newfoundland. The sun always shines. So, yeah, for me, it's like the land of endless sunshine. I know it's not like that always.
Oh, okay. So I too now am looking forward to your trip here because if you're the person who's responsible for bringing the sun, come on over and maybe stick around a little while longer if you could, please.
Yeah, I should come more often. Yeah.
Deidre, thanks for this. It's great. I appreciate the chat.
Okay, no, my pleasure. Take care.
Deidre Nuttall is an Irish writer with a PhD in folklore and ethnology, and like you just heard, on her way over here soon to bring some sunshine. But that conversation, though, it obviously touches on some of what we're talking about here today, in the studio, right? Like the geography, or I guess isolation, or just the makeup of the province, or Newfoundland and Labrador, kind of influences the folklore and the stories that are told.
I found it interesting that she said that it was more relevant here than in Ireland. And I've often heard people say Newfoundland is more Irish than Ireland.
Yeah.
And I think in that way we are, is that we do. You go out around now, you'll still got the Fairland, and they'll tell you that, you can't go out after dark without a crust of bread in your pocket or a nickel around your neck, or there's always something you've got to do to protect yourself, or they'll pin some medal to a baby's chest, whether they know him or not. It's like, take this medal to protect your baby. And so we still do that today.
So that's Helen C. Escott there, one of my guests. The other is Clayton B. Smith. Clay, what do you think?
I really loved what she was speaking about with the geography-based difference of these stories. I found when I was researching the difference just between communities in Newfoundland, there was such a change in the same story when I was trying to hunt down examples of Selkie folklore. On the west coast of Newfoundland, I found examples of children or young men thought to be Selkies who had extreme strength and could do the work of 4 men in a day. But then when I came to where my novel is based, it had been central, kind of in the more central coasts, it was more about them being lusted after and being being thought of as beautiful and finding love. And again, as we discussed at the beginning of the show, because these communities were also isolated, they had their own kind of microcultures. It really depended on just where you were from as to what these stories meant to you and what they were saying.
Oh, I found out we did each year. Typically, we'll do a show on mummering traditions, right? And depending on the community, some of the traditions can be pretty specific to that area, even though they might be tied back to whether it's England or whatever else. But it's just kind of fascinating to talk about what community had what tradition and how long it's been going on for, because there are big differences because of the isolation.
Yeah, I mean, we see that in language as well. I think that's often discussed as like the fact that each different cove has its own kind of dialect, and you see such a big change in the way people speak as you go across the island. So it's only natural that the oral storytelling, which was such a huge part of our culture, is also so influenced by these little isolated areas. And I think it's beautiful that you kind of can capture this exact same origin story, like in my instance the Selkie, but often you see it with fairies or mermaids, and depending on the community you go to, the relationship they have with them is so different. Like in Helen's book, referring to the fairies as good people is something you're only going to see in some communities, and others is going to be quite the opposite.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think all Newfoundlanders have a little bit of fairy dust over them, because we're all storytellers and we're all really funny and we can all sing and we can all dance. So I think there's something magical about Newfoundlanders. Now, not all of us should sing and dance, but
I'm in the should not category, even though I enjoy it.
Yeah, but if you heard a beat, if you heard a jig being played, your feet would move. Yeah. You'd have no control over it. And you know the words to every Newfoundland song. It's just in your DNA. And I think for us as Newfoundlanders, which is why we're so loved everywhere, is because we can tell a story better than anybody else can tell the story.
What's research like for when you do these types of things? Like, how do you go from coming up with an idea to be like, okay, I need to find out some stuff about this?
For myself, I first went to locals in the area, tried to ask around people in the communities to see. Well, I wasn't set on Salvage in the beginning, but trying to find people in my hometown area that did have some kind of experience of the story that I wanted to tell, or some retelling. And then after that, I really leaned heavily on the folklore archives at Munn and just hearing the personal stories of people from across the island. And it was a lot of hours of digging to kind of put together things, because things aren't. As we've already discussed, there's different names for different things all across the province. So seeing the amount of stories that I found that were much closer to Selkie origin, that were described or categorized as mermaid stories, it was the majority of the book, to be honest. So I had to really hunt down and read through a lot of stories that weren't relevant to find the ones that had those traits that actually made it link back to the original story from the Orkney Islands,
So when you're in the folklore archives, how does that work? Like, what types of things are you unearthing over there?
Oh God. For the most part, I found it best to look for disasters or significant happenings, and then kind of go from there and see stories surrounding that. Now, they do have a lot of things actually cataloged to talk about folklore, to talk about folklore, quite obviously. I mean, talk about different creatures and things like that. So they have a section for mermaids, they have a section for fairies and things like that. And then I was going through those kind of happenings, and there's usually more than one telling of each story. So then trying to find the different instances of it and seeing it from different perspectives until you find the one that kind of works or doesn't for my own story. So it's a lot of time, a lot of time just kind of reading and looking into things to see where the links could be.
And the stuff you're finding, is that print? Is it tape? Or what is it?
It's a combination. A lot of print. There's a lot of just recorded interviews that for the most part are done kind of word for word. But there is also some some audio interviews. There's a handful of visual ones, but very few. But it's mostly just all been hand recorded. There's a lot of handwritten letters that have been sent in that are just photocopies of these that you get to get your hands on and leaf through. It's quite interesting.
Yeah. So if you're looking up a certain incident, so something really bad happens, but then there's multiple stories and tellings around, and it's about a Selkie or mermaid or something, what was it like to read through those letters, or the correspondence, or just the accounts?
Some of them were kind of terrible, to be honest.
Yeah.
Because you knew that as a lot of what Helen's book talks about is, there's something unfortunate, something sinister behind all of this. The actual stories that I'm reading are kind of how these people have chosen to deal with them. But in other instances, they're very fun. That there was a character here that was obviously very energetic, very exciting, very interesting to be around, and therefore they became larger than life. And suddenly folklore sort of developed around that character. So in some instances, I was enjoying imagining what this person could have been like, that was known to carry a sled with 3 men on it for 10 miles across open plains, and you can't really believe it, but that there must have been someone there that was larger than life, and that's kind of fun to imagine. And then the other instances of people being walked out into the sea to their death and things, and that being referred to as a Selkie, it's just dark, because we're essentially just reading about self-harm that was then all wrapped up into, no, they're fine, they just swam away.
Yeah, they were a Selkie. It's okay. Right.
Sure, yeah.
What a dark way. But again, just using stuff to explain things that are either so horrible that you may not want to think about it, or just as the way to explain what you don't understand. And folks, if you're listening, if in your part of the province, Newfoundland and Labrador, if you've got a story to share with us, email thesignal@cbc.ca. You can text us 709-327-8206. The lines are open, 709-722-7111, 1-800-563-8255. And as you're listening to this show, or if you watch us on YouTube, it'll be up later on today, and you're thinking, gosh, I really have something, call the Signal line and leave us a message, 709-576-5260. You were just listening to Clayton B. Smith there, an author, talking about his recent book, new book, A Seal of Salvage. And we also have prolific author Helen Scott here. How you doing?
Good, thanks.
Tell us about your research.
So for my research, and my books are all crime thrillers. So I run each one like a real police investigation. So I do a lot of research, and Mon Archive is a treasure trove of information. I read a lot of other books and information, and I like to interview the experts. So I'll go back to a lot of police officers. Larry Doey was actually the contact for, and actually Larry Morgan in the book is named after him.
Right.
So this book is a tribute to him also. And he was a treasure trove. I could text Larry at 6 o'clock in the morning and say, Larry, can you tell me if the fairies were here? And he'll come back within 30 seconds with like 3 paragraphs of history just from the top of his head. So I always go to the experts for that. And the most recent Operation book is Operation Masonic, and that's a history of Freemasonry in the province. So I had to interview a lot of Masons, and of course, Masons don't talk. So you got to do a lot of research to get information like that. But that also aligns with Masonry. Also aligns with the belief in fairy culture, because once again, we're talking about traditions and rituals that have been passed down, that came over from England and Scotland, that have been passed down through families here. And you'll have generations of Masons here who will never tell you that they're Masons. So it's I like doing a lot of research and really talking to people and going out and getting the experts. And because I don't want to, I get a lot of police officers who read my books, and I would be horrified if one read it and went, "No, that's not how an investigation would go." So I always try to make it as real as possible. And a lot of readers will contact me and say, "Is this real, or did I remember reading this in a paper somewhere?" And you know what? One of my main sources for research is local media, because I'll go into the Telegram or what used to be the Daily News, or back through CBC's archives or NTV's or whatever, and go back to look for murdered and missing women stories that were in the coverage from the courtroom. And sometimes that's the only place where you can get the actual information, because you can't actually get the police files. So it would have to be the media coverage that I'm using, and that is the importance of local media. If they're telling our story, and they're telling it as our history now. So going back, that's where I get a lot of my research from.
Yeah, especially that rough cut of history, right? Just as it starts.
Right from the courtroom. Yeah. And you're not going to get that from a history book.
When you've done, whether it's with the Masons or other research, what are some things that have kind of really struck you as like, wow, now that is, because I know there's so much that's really compelling and interesting, but what's something that kind of comes to mind that was like, wow?
When I did the research for Operation Masonic, I was shocked at the tentacles that they had and how they changed Newfoundland. Our first prime minister was a Freemason. There's a rumor that Joey Smallwood's first cabinet were all or mostly Freemasons. So they've been in our government making decisions since Confederation, and when you look at Hitler was obsessed with Freemasonry. He was obsessed with getting the Holy Grail, the Ark of the Covenant, and the Sword of Destiny, which is the sword that was inside of Jesus. And he thought if he had all 3, that he would rule the world. That was why he had this special cult unit that went looking for this stuff, and the Freemasons had it. And there was always a rumor they were moving it around. And there was a report at one point, it was in the Hill of Tara in Ireland, and it was sent over to the new country. Well, it came to the new country. It had to come to Newfoundland because we were a British colony. It's not going to go to Nova Scotia, to Oak Island, because they were part of Canada. So, and during the Second World War, of course, Hitler torpedoed us 6 times. He didn't torpedo Nova Scotia. So, and there was a plan for Hitler to invade Newfoundland, because at that time we were considered the Gibraltar of North America, because we have the most strategic point here for coverage over North America. And so he was obsessed with Newfoundland. So, and there's loads of reports, and we have reports of, after the war ended, there was a U-boat surrendered out off Bay Bolt Harbor, and the periscope is down in the Naval Club downtown. So the Nazis were here. They came aboard. We found a weather station in Labrador in the 1970s with German bulbs in it. So we know Nazis came ashore in Newfoundland, and there was loads of stories of them being here and searching. So what were they searching for?
Yeah.
So I think the Freemasons bought their treasure here. And actually, the Masonic Temple downtown is the first Masonic temple built in North America. So why would they put their headquarters here for North America? I'm telling you, we have treasure here.
We've got Karen's on the line, calling from Logie Bay. How you doing?
Hi, how's it going, Adam?
Good, hanging out, talking about folklore and now Masons and a bunch of stuff. So what do you have?
Oh, my heavens, Betsy, you're going down so many rabbit holes today. It's crazy. And I
started the week off on a high note.
Just as well. You know what? It's a great day for it, too. Every day is a great day to talk about that here. I came in kind of in the middle, and when I was listening to the content of the show, it's like, oh, my God, this is totally my wheelhouse. So I am the president of St. John's Storytelling. And if anybody's ever looking for stories, not that Dale Jarvis, God rest Larry Dowie, not that Dale Jarvis is not an excellent source of stories, but Dale Jarvis actually started St. John's Storytelling. So if you're ever looking for stories, contact us. We can put you in contact with storytellers. But coincidentally, now on your subject today, on the 20th of June, out at the Cubits Legacy Center, we are doing a show for Year of the Arts all about fairies.
Fantastic.
Right on. Tell us more. What's going to be included with this?
It's going to be a show out in Cubits there at the Legacy Center at their facility, and we got some grant money from Year of the Arts, as many arts organizations did. So we decided to go on the road. And that particular date, we're going to be at Cubits Legacy Center. So Gary Green is our host, who is a treasure trove of Newfoundland folklore and stories. Janine Walsh, who's from the area. Peter Laracy, who's from that area, and Dennis Flynn, who's from that area, will all be telling fairy stories. Because it's midsummer, right? That's midsummer when the fairies were supposed to come out and dance and do their thing and be mischievous and, and all that stuff. So we thought that was a great theme for that particular show.
What speaks to you then, whether it's fairies or other mythical creatures in folklore and the telling of it in Newfoundland and Labrador?
Well, I mean, we were always told, going up on the barrens picking the berries in the fall, or any time you'd be out as a child, or even adults, you had to do certain things. We were told that in our childhood. So I'm 62, and so, but everybody around that time was told the same thing in my community. You'd always put a slice of bread in your pocket or across the bread, yeah. Turn your petticoat inside out or turn your jacket inside out. Like something. And if you were ever going berry picking, which we did in the fall, every fall, if you had put on an article of clothing inside out unintentionally, my mother would say, don't fix it. In other words, you had to leave that the way it was because there was a reason why you did that day. It wasn't just that you were really clumsy putting on your clothes, where your socks were inside out of your shoe, or your shirt or something. She'd say, no, leave that because that's a charm against the fairies, So, I mean, all this stuff to me is so magical. And we just have, there's so many, storytelling traditions throughout the world, actually, with fairies and selkies and mythical creatures. But here we just have such a wonderful history of it, and we have such a wonderful treasure trove. And actually, one of our local storytellers, Michelle Clemens, she actually made up a fairy story herself, And I mean, when we did a podcast over the pandemic, and it's called Home Out of It because everybody was home out of it, and we were doing everything online and virtually. And one of the stories, one of our storytellers tells a story about fairies, in Belvedere Cemetery when she was growing up and she would be going to school, and how she befriended the fairies, and her mother would make clothes for the fairies, and they would bring, and she had a very good relationship with the fairies. Now, we also know that many places wasn't that way, right? Like Hubert Fury has a wonderful story about the fairies from out around Conception Harbour. So it's so magical to me. Like, do you believe in them? I mean, it's up to yourself, right? But I mean, to me, whether we believe in them or not, there's something underneath all that, right? Like years ago, people explained away things that they really couldn't explain. Perhaps, we don't know. Often, I'm told, well, the fairies actually came on the ships when people came from Ireland, and they stowed away, kind of down, in the holds of the ships, and they came over with the people, and they're still here today, even though you don't hear about them or you don't see them. But, they've retreated. They've retreated to their own kind of haunts, because lots of places here you could hide for years and no one ever finds you, right? So I think it's just so interesting and wonderful and charming and beautiful. It's a beautiful part of our storytelling culture here. And I bet there's lots of stories about fairies and mermaids and mythical creatures, selkies and all that are out there in those little, nooks and crannies of communities that, You know, they're wonderful stories. If you can only get people who still remember them and want to tell them, it's fabulous.
Karen, thanks for this. Hit us up with the date again now before I let you go for Cupid's.
It's June 20th, and it's going to be at the Cupid's Legacy Centre. I'm not sure of the time, but they will post it, online, and I'm sure on their website, and we will post it on ours as well, St. John's Storytelling. And anybody who's interested, lovely Johns out to Cupid's, and just come and enjoy all the wonderful fairy stories, and they're going to be fabulous. I'm looking forward to that event.
All right, Karen, thanks for the call.
All the best, and a wonderful show as usual. Take care, Adam.
Cheers. There you go. Right, you talk about fairies. There's way more storytellers out there. You got the stories all lined up. And speaking of stories, what are you both working on for the future now?
There's a book coming out the first week of July, but Flanker Press. It's called We Will Meet Again. It's the story, it's not a crime thriller, actually. I'm going in a different direction with this one. It's the story of these 4 women from the same family. And it's about how generational trauma gets passed down through women until one person finally turns it into generational strength. And it starts with this lady named Hadley, who's just about to turn 100. And it's the week before November 11th. And her first boyfriend was killed in World War II. And then she ended up marrying his best friend. So she always felt that she lost. And we lost a generation of men in World War II and in World War I. And when you lose a generation of men, what happens to the women back here, particularly those who were married to them and had children? Well, you got to remember, in 1940s, women could not get a bank loan. We couldn't buy a car. It wasn't until I think it was 1963 a woman was allowed to open a bank account without a male signature. So she was in a situation, she couldn't get a bank loan, she couldn't get an apartment, she couldn't get a house, she couldn't get a car, she couldn't get credit because she didn't have a man. So if you had 6 or 7 kids, you had to start farming them out. Your sister would take one, your cousin would take one, the next door neighbor would take one. No one did background checks, your kids just went out. And some would be put into servitude and some would be raised as their children. There are people today, because of Ancestry.ca, are finding out their parents are really their brother and is really their mother is really their sister.
Yeah.
And because of this, so in We Will Meet Again, it's about how that trauma of war affected, we all read the stories about how it affected the men. But for the women back here who had to keep the home fires burning, they had another war that they had to fight. And We Will Meet Again is about the war that these women fought and how it was passed down through generation after generation.
Wow. All right. Clay?
For myself, my next book doesn't come out now till 2026 with Breakwater. I mean, A Seal of Salvage is still warm from the printing press right now.
Yeah, it's kind of mean to me. Like, you got a brand new book. I'm like, what is next? Tell us. We need more.
But no, I am excited. My first draft is due sometime early December, and I'm going a little more modern with it, still keeping with some notes of folklore and magical realism, but it'll be based of St. John's in a more modern era, talking about sort of addiction issues and how the world can look a little differently from a different perspective, specifically regarding time and the passing of time, and how that can really influence how people treat an island, a community, and each other.
All right. Thank you both for this. Clayton B. Smith, Helen C. Escott. I appreciate it. Looking ahead, that's it for today. Tomorrow, we're talking about the federal budget. I have a panel of folks lined up to talk about what's been announced already, what they expect to be announced, and what it all means for you. We will also circle back and look at the provincial budget. Thoughts on the show, the signal at cbc.ca. We talked about folklore today. What about Folk Fest stuff, the 48th annual, coming up this summer, 12th to 14th of July at Bannerman. Taking us out, here is Mo Kenny with You Belong to Me, who was also obviously playing at the Folk Fest.